Hi everyone, and welcome to the Wrongfully Heard Podcast. This is the Wrongfully Heard Podcast.
And wrongfully convicted.
In this case, nobody got justice.
Was wrongly convicted of a miscarriage of justice. We found new scientific evidence proving her innocence.
Welcome to the Wrongfully Heard Podcast. I am your host, Kaylee, and today we are going to be analyzing a case that occurred on John Button and how that day he ended up on death row. So this occurred in 1963, Perth, WA. Let's take a look into how society was at the time. So everyone was in fear because there was a serial killer on the loose, but little did John Button know that he was not going to be the victim, he was going to be the predator. This is a story about how a grieving teenager with a nervous stutter was coerced into confessing for the murder of his girlfriend, and he undertook a 40-year battle on defending himself against the state's lies. So let's get into the background and the incident itself. So this wrongful conviction was tied together from a perfect storm of situational variables. John had an emotional argument with his girlfriend Rosemary that night, and it created a presence of an opportunistic serial killer. It created a situation where circumstantial evidence was twisted to create the prosecution's case. The argument between John and Rosemary was over a piece of fish. During his 19th birthday celebration, John and his girlfriend Rosemary had a minor argument. It ended up with Rosemary storming out of the house and walking home. John followed her in his car, which was a French Simca. John was driving at a walking pace alongside Rosemary and was pleading with her to get into the car so he could get her home safely. When Rosemary stubbornly refused to get into the car, John pulled over for a cigarette. John was just waiting for Rosemary to see sense. A few minutes later, John decided to drive to follow Rosemary to make sure she got home safe, where she discovered Rosemary's body lying in the sand at the side of the road, and she had a massive head wound. So John went and took Rosemary to the nearest hospital, and from the moment that John reached out for help, his status in this case was instantaneous. He was no longer the grieving boyfriend. He was the prime suspect. To the police, this case was open and shut. They saw that the argument, a dented car, and the victim's blood on the vehicle. The immediate jump to John being the main suspect shows how much investigative tunnel vision occurred in this case. They were not looking for a killer, they were building a case upon a convenient target, leading directly into the interrogation room. The mechanics of a false confession, coercion and distress. Studies have shown that a lot of false confessions have come from a state of learned helplessness. This occurred during the exonerated Fives case and also in this case. When a suspect like John Button, who has a pronounced stutter and high levels of anxiety, is subjected to physical and emotional abuse while already in a state of shock, their psychological defenses collapse. John's interrogation was not only unfair, but it was not the right process. So he was subject to long hours of hostile questioning, and he was punched in the stomach to break his train of thought. The psychological turning point during the investigation is when the police bluntly told John that Rosemary had died while he was in custody. The police just said, if you confess, you'll be able to go home. John was in complete distress of the loss of his girlfriend mixed with anxiety, and he had faith in the justice system that if this was taken to trial, he would not be convicted. He decided to sign the guilty plea and he would go home. With this vulnerability, we move to the trial. So the defense was also a point of misconduct where the defense was feeding John these narratives that were based on truth, but they weren't based on John's truth. So basically they would tell John that he can't tell the court that the police beat him up because no one would believe him and no one would trust him, and therefore he would get convicted. So John didn't tell the truth during the trial, and he said he was never beaten, that the police did the due process, but it wasn't him. Clearly, this is where there would be gaps in the story and people wouldn't make sense of why he signed the guilty plea. The defense also said, if you say something bad about the police during the trial, the jury will not believe you. Might have been true in the time where people had high regard and high trust in the police and didn't believe that misconduct would occur from a policeman. But in this case, in a trial, you're supposed to say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And this is not what occurred. And this is why it led to the way it did. The psychological trauma peaked during this trial when the jury was asked to give a verdict for John. They said, we find the defendant not guilty. John was overjoyed and he believed that he had faith in the justice system once again. However, this was quickly overturned because the jury said the wrong thing, corrected their statement saying, we have found the defendant guilty. So John went into shock. He had a psychological wound that it would take decades to heal. Now we're going to deconstruct the forensic evidence. So we're going to talk about science versus fabrication. In many wrongful conviction cases, we see that the physical evidence is moved around and swayed around to fit the prosecution's theories. But however, in John Button's case, the prosecution's theory actually defied the laws of physics in a way. So we're going through the evidence presented versus the forensic reality and the inconsistency. So first of all, we're going through John's car, the Simca. They found what they believed was Rosemary's blood on the front of the car and a dent mark also in the front of the car that they believed that was formed through the collision of Rosemary with the car that night. But the dent was formed much earlier, and forensics had believed that if Rosemary did hit the car, it would have created a different scooping shape rather than the dent that was put on the car. And that the blood on the car was found out to be red paint. Secondly is the blood pool location. So the police claimed that the blood pool was found 8 inches away from the road. However, the forensic reality was that 7 witnesses saw the victim's body around 3 to 4 meters away from the road. To fix their narrative to fit around their theory, they changed their story to believe that John carried Rosemary's body to take her to the railway tracks to run her over, to hide the evidence, and that he didn't actually make it all the way before he saw that someone had caught him, which is a very far stretch in the story. The next one would be the motive. The motive that the police believed that John did what he did to Rosemary because he was denied sex that night. However, the real story was that they just had an argument over a piece of fish. It was John's birthday, and the couple had already been intimate before this, so it was a very far-fetched theory. To cement this narrative to seem credible during the trial to the jury, the police went through great measures to make sure that the evidence fit into their theory. So there was a vehicle examiner named Trevor Condren, and he stated that the car did not hit a body. It's more likely to be a collision with another car or something similar of a sort. And the quote was from the police that, "Trevor, if you want a job here on Monday morning, you better say it has." The whole investigation, the whole collection of evidence has just been a lie. Number 5, the real serial killer, Edgar Cooke. The failure to capture the real killer, Edgar Cooke, highlights that the police were under enormous pressure. Cooke was a serial killer who didn't really have a pattern of crimes. He killed a bunch of different people, men, women from different places that were done in different areas. So whether it be shooting someone, running them over with a car, stabbings. So the police believed that all of these crimes were unconnected. While John Button was in prison, Edgar Cooke was finally convicted for a bunch of the murders that occurred. And during the trial, Eric confessed to the murder of Rosemary Anderson. He described that he had stolen a Holden, and he described the exact location and the exact part where the body struck the car. The police responded to this as a way of saying that Cooke had this big ego. They claimed that Cooke was lying because that the impact happened 100 meters north. By labeling the truth as obviously fabricated, the courts protected a verdict rather than the public interest. Even Cooke's gallows confession, where he confessed minutes before his execution with a hand on the Bible, was dismissed. The path to exoneration. The 2002 appeal was successful because the courts shifted from hearsay to scientific reenactment. Investigative journalist Estelle Blackburn's work and crash test expert Rusty Haight provided the hard forensic evidence required for John's exoneration. So the crash test with lifelike dummies proved a bunch of critical takeaways. So first, the impossibility that John's car, which was a Simca, could have impacted with Rosemary Anderson that night. The Simca lacked the scoop damage a body would inevitably cause. The physics of the vehicle made John's car an impossible weapon. The physics of the Holden impact. The test proved that a Holden with a sun visor, which was Cooke's car, would ricochet a body exactly 2 to 3 meters to the left, perfectly matching the witnesses during 1963 that the police ignored. Similar fact evidence. The court finally admitted testimony from other surviving hit-and-run victims of Eric, proving a distinct modus operandi. In 2002, John was exonerated by Chief Justice David Malcolm, and he ruled that the verdict was unsafe and unsatisfactory, and John was finally released. He put a statement into the papers that it was joy at last. The human cost of investigative error and state crime is staggering. The wrongful conviction impacted John's life greatly, and he was sentenced to many years at Fremantle Prison, which was an incredibly inhumane way to live as an innocent man. In 1975, the weight of the stigma and the trauma and everything led John Button to attempt suicide. It really just shows how impactful wrongful convictions are on human beings. Like, if you had experienced the weight of a crime that you had not committed and spent all those years in prison and fought for your freedom, and even when you are released, there are still people who don't believe you, and you can still be declined away from jobs, and the ex gratia payment isn't enough to keep you afloat. It's a lot of issues that occur after, and they don't give any reintegration for individuals who were put into prison, who were wrongfully convicted. They only do the reintegration for those who were appropriately convicted, charged, and sentenced, which doesn't really make any sense, because you take them away from society at the age of 19 and you spit them out many years later, and then you expect them to be trusting, law-abiding citizens. It just doesn't make sense. John views this state's ex gratia payment as miserable, advocating for legislative change so that compensation is determined by courts, not by politicians. Since his exoneration, John Button has actually been one of the biggest advocates for wrongful conviction here in WA. He is actually part of the WA Innocence Project, which I was a part of, and I was fortunate enough to meet with him and listen to his story, and the fact that he dedicates his life to advocating for wrongful convictions to help other people is tremendous. You would think that someone, after all this time, all the pain, that they would stay away from the system, but he is so passionate in really just pushing for the truth and pushing for justice. I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for everyone for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to John Button's case of wrongful conviction. Thank you for watching the Wrongfully Heard podcast, where we give voices to those who once were not heard. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you guys next time.